Welcome to New Technologies and Racial Bias. This is the 6th installment of our UWGB Technology in Context series, sponsored by the Austin Cofrin School of Business and presented by yours truly. My name is Oliver Buechse. I am the Executive in Residence for Digital Transformation at the Business School and also the CEO of my own business, Advancing Digital. Over the past 5 weeks, we've talked about fundamental technologies from artificial intelligence, virtual reality, robotics, and so forth. Today is the first of 5 more sessions where we're going to pick up contemporary topics and put technology in the context of those major trends. Our first one is racial bias. This is obviously a very big topic. The national conversation has been about it. And, sometimes there's sort of a dichotomy that says just good, bad, left, right. And I hope you can take away from today's conversation that there's a lot more to that topic. So what I want to cover today is a little background on bias first. We'll go into the biology and neurology of bias a little bit. And then we'll look at examples of racial bias. The main segment is going to be about the impact of new technologies. And there's 2 types of impact. There are many examples where technology actually amplifies racial bias, or at least it includes racial bias in a way that you would not expect and should not expect. But there's also examples of how technology can help us overcome racial bias. If you have questions at any point, feel free to ask. You can also put them in chat. Catherine will be monitoring the chat and let me know if there are questions in the chat. So let's start with bias. If we go to dictionary.com, it says it's prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. Unconscious bias, this is from the website of University of California, San Francisco, takes that one step further to say it's sort of social stereotypes about certain groups of people. That's what the dialogue is typically about. It's not so much the overt bias, the open racism, but it is the things we assume about others, maybe subconsciously, unconsciously, things that we've learned that influence our thinking, and in many cases, our decision-making. If we take a step back, with these definitions, bias already has a bad reputation, right? It's prejudice. It's something bad. It's almost like a mistake that we're making. But let's look at a couple of facts. Our brain processes 11 million bits per second. It's kind of like a supercomputer. Of those, only 16 to 40 bits reach our consciousness. So our brain obviously has to run our body. All the, biological decisions to digest and to have the heart pumping and all of that is also processed in the brain. So only a fraction of that reaches the conscious level. The fact that we can walk around and breathe all without thinking about it is owed to that fact. And it becomes really critical that our brain can operate autonomously when a very rapid response is needed. So most of the decisions that we make are made pre-consciously, subconsciously, unconsciously. And that is important. If you sort of go back into the ancient history of humans, right, our ancestors, if ancestor A had a functioning brain, they would see the bear charge and immediately run without losing a split second. And as a result, everybody sort of with him might learn that behavior and also run when the bear comes. So that bias, run when you see the bear, is passed down. It's a learned behavior. Ancestor B maybe had a different approach. They said, let's see, maybe the bear just wants to play and got eaten as a result. So there was no offspring. The bias could not be passed down. let's play with that poisonous snake instead of taking a step back, right? So bias, principally, bias is not a bad thing. It is a survival mechanism. It allows us to focus just on a few things that require the highest attention, whereas our body autonomously deals with most everything else. So how does that work neurologically? There are multiple areas in our brain that sort of move information along, and in some cases they don't reach the conscious level. If it is a fear-based response, there's a part of our brain called the amygdala. It processes the fear-based information. It is part of the older part of our brain, subcortex. The mesolimbic pathway processes information related to social, emotional, or physiological rewards. And then there's the hippocampus that forms links between memories and deciphers new incoming information. So if we see someone who looks like someone of whom we have a memory, the hippocampus might then sort of draw on that memory to say, what do we know about a person who looks like that? The processing time in all of these areas is just milliseconds. It's way too fast to allow for conscious consideration. So our brain was not programmed to think about every new stimulus. It was programmed to respond autonomously and automatically to the majority of stimuli that were coming in. So the vast majority of categorizations that we make are based on fear or social rewards or memories that we have previously formed. So subconscious bias is not a bad habit that you've acquired in sort of becoming a bad person. It is a neurological reality. But we are not necessarily. Oh, sorry. Before we get to that, so let's look at the downside of having that bias, right? So if our brain operates in that manner, right? Let's say we see somebody for the very first time, and one of the things our brain looks for is how much do they look like us? Again, it's a biological feature. Birds of a feather flock together, right? They recognize something that looks like them. And logically, we should know that the mere appearance of a person, whether they look like us or not, should not dictate their personality, their trustworthiness, any level of danger that comes from them. But our brain operates differently. There's a lot of studies that show that people make very quick decisions based on how much something is like them, is familiar versus unfamiliar. It's almost back to that tribal, it doesn't look like me, it doesn't smell like me, it's dangerous. Whereas if it does look like me and smell like me, then it's probably safe. Now, there are a couple of ways in which we can check ourselves. So we are not beholden to that subconscious bias. And that principle is called metacognition. It's the awareness and understanding of our own thought process. That's sort of the beauty of not being a prehistoric animal or an insect or bird. We have that cortex power. And so even though only 0.04% of our bits are conscious, if we select the right stimuli to respond, then that can help us a lot. And there's another part of the brain that is tasked with doing that, and that's the medial prefrontal cortex. It allows us to sort of take a slower route to decision making. Instead of amygdala firing the fear impulse and boom, we run. The medial prefrontal cortex says, hold on for a moment. This is not a bear charging at us. This is a person coming. Let's collect additional information about that person before we make a decision to run or to be afraid or anything like that. There's another advantage, which is that these fear-based responses or any of the other mechanisms are not set in stone. The concept is called neuroplasticity. So we can learn, we can even restructure the pathways in our brain based on new information that we're learning, and that's going to be really critical when we look at some of the examples. So biases can be replaced. They can be replaced with different categorizations. So these shortcuts that lead us to prejudice can be replaced with shortcuts that are not based on prejudice. So any questions on this principle, right? Bias is a biological, a neurological reality. There are different mechanisms, fear, reward, memories, that trigger these shortcuts in our brain. We have, again, biological and neurological mechanisms to overcome that. And if we employ these metacognition efforts, we can actually reprogram our brain. Any questions about that?
Oliver, I have a quick question about it. Is some of the pre-programmed biases, such as running from the bear, being afraid of a snake, I assume that those are learned also, as opposed to any type of genetic transmission.
Yeah, so in most of what I've been reading, the main theory is that biases are learned, right? Typically from observing our parents in certain situations, but not related to the preparation for this study. But if you look at some animals, horses, their animals are not sort of nesting for a long time. They have to get up and run. And so, I often wonder if there's not some part of genetic imprinting. We've talked, or we would have talked last time if we had enough time, of encoding information in DNA. So it is possible to encode information in DNA, and why would Mother Nature not take advantage of that opportunity? But for the purposes of what we're talking about here, the core assumption is that these biases are learned. Other questions? All right, then let's look at some examples of racial bias. Hiring is a very sensitive topic. If you've ever dealt with HR as a supervisor, or you've worked in HR, or even if you've gone through a hiring process, you know that there's a lot of sensitivity and the disclosures that you read and so forth. And yet, despite all of that attention that has been given to it, there are examples. Studies have been conducted where the mere name of a candidate seems to suggest or seems to make a certain impression on people, that if it is a Black African-American sounding name, people make certain assumptions about the educational level or the likelihood of success. In one study in 2004, the American Economic Association found that if the name of the candidate that was presented to decision makers was Jamal, they discounted the qualifications versus if the name was Greg. And Jamal factually needed to have 8 more years of experience to overcome that discount as they varied the different scenarios. So that's pretty significant just based on the name. Another one is accent, speaking with an accent, viewed less positively by interviewers than someone who's not speaking with an accent, or if the applicant has an ethnic name, it also can have an impact. So, these should not be informing our decisions. Somebody was born in another country. I was born in another country. I have a German accent. These might be higher qualified, more educated applicants, but yet it is, again, that trigger does not sound like me that causes us to make assumptions about the individual. Background checks are another source of potential discrimination. When a company was acquired by Walmart, they went through all the workers in the warehouse, And they conducted a criminal history check, and between 100 to 200 African-American workers lost their jobs based on that criminal history check, whereas several of the white workers who also had a criminal history were allowed to keep their jobs, right? So there's a conception of the combination of a certain race with an event in the history was perceived to be an elimination criteria, whereas if it was white race, somehow we can give them a waiver. Objectively, there's no justification for that. Cartoons, entertainment are a major source of stereotyping. Again, as a German, whenever I watch a movie and the villain is first introduced, I'm like, okay, wait for it. And lo and behold, here comes the German accent, right? Christoph Waltz is always chosen to play the villain. And other stereotypes, whether it's related to women or to certain ethnic groups. Now, in this particular picture, sort of the cartoonists are making the case, let us stereotype in peace. But the reality is that these stereotypes influence our perception. We consume media, we consume humor, and if you do that, from childhood on, then it forms your beliefs about certain races that maybe you've never encountered. I know as a child, I heard at my parents' parties, certain jokes were told, or in school you hear certain jokes, and oftentimes it was like something like a Frenchman, a British, and a German walk into a bar, right? And so their stereotypes are being established, and you don't even challenge that anymore. After a while, you sort of assume that even though it's clear it was humor, it was a cartoon, it was an exaggeration, somewhere the essence of that joke, of that caricature, sort of takes hold in your brain. That's the hippocampus again that's working its deed there. Not a laughing matter at all, mortgage lending. A lot of people apply for mortgages, and it's not easy for the bank, because if the bank makes a poor decision on whom to give $100,000, $200,000, or $500,000, they could lose a substantial amount of money. And so the bank uses a number of criteria. What's your income? What's your credit score? Have you had a house before? How long have you been at your job? Et cetera, et cetera. So that there's a number of criteria. And even if you adjust for income, you find that the approval rates differ between Black and white applicants. And so HUD and HMDA always evaluate that. And if a bank, in fact, has these types of records, then there's an investigation, and there are very, very high penalties that are levied on the banks. And it puts the banks sometimes in a difficult spot, because they try to make the case, we were using objective criteria. We were using the same exact criteria for every race. The problem is that many of these criteria themselves correlate with race, right? So if African Americans are economically disadvantaged, then in all likelihood their credit scores will be lower, because they've had more incidents over time of maybe not being able to pay a bill on time, or maybe even higher debt levels and so forth. So what should the bank do? Not use these criteria at all and lower the quality of the decision, or use the criteria, try to make good lending decisions, but as a result, discriminate. So this is a very tricky one. It's not as black and white, if you will, as it may seem at first glance. Other forms of bias that we hear a lot about: racial profiling in law enforcement. My son is training to become a police officer, and as he is going on drive-arounds, the experienced officer will say, look out, we're now entering the bad part of town, watch your six, right? Or keep your eyes open. And right there is sort of that's where the bias is being formed. We're now in a part of town that's maybe has a higher share of minority people living in it. And right here, I'm telling you, this is more danger. So there, the association between race and danger is made. And maybe that officer is drawing on factual experience, but nonetheless, it builds that bias. And then as a result, African Americans, Latinos are pulled over with a higher frequency. When they are pulled over, the police officers are more on edge, and that leads then to escalation of situations, which sometimes end very badly. Representation, or the lack of representation in decision-making bodies, leadership teams, boards, governing bodies. We always hear about the Academy Awards and the Oscars, and they're trying so hard now to have representation in those bodies. But again, it sometimes is a challenge. I know many organizations in Wisconsin are struggling with that because our population does not have a very high share of diverse individuals, especially in Northeast Wisconsin. And if you want someone with local ties and with diversity background, well, there's only so many to choose from, and they may already be on a number of boards or have other commitments. So then it becomes a real struggle to find individuals. Refusal of service to certain groups. This is not just beyond race. We know the baker who did not want to make a wedding cake for a gay couple, or people who experience discrimination in public service based on their race. When you look at what is going on, you find a couple of categories of racial bias. The first one is sort of the old-fashioned racism, where it's not a subconscious bias, but an outspoken belief in the superiority of one race over another. Sort of the Jim Crow South, whites are superior to blacks, and people believe that it was handed down within families and so forth. The modern racism may have a slightly different root. It's supposedly based on resentment of a group based on a perceived disadvantage of or somebody else's advantage. So if we have affirmative action and that allows for more representation of minorities, then the majority may perceive that as unfair and as a result resent the minority group for having that advantage. Implicit bias, that goes back to the neurology discussion that we've had, right? It's things we've learned as children, hearing comments, seeing images, or maybe even individual memories, and it influences how we process information. And then there's the systemic institutional racism. This is not a decision that is happening in my brain, but here the racism is basically baked into the system. It results from the way laws have been written. Think of voting laws and restricting the number of hours that people can vote, or forcing people to vote on a workday. So if somebody really needs the money from their job and doesn't get off until 6 o'clock, it's going to be really hard for them to make it to the vote. And if that reality is more prevalent among minority groups, then as a result of the way the voting system is built, they would be disadvantaged. And that would be an example of systemic or institutional racism. Any questions about racial bias or the different types of bias and racism? All right, then let's get into the core here of how does all of this play out in technology. So the starting point of inequality when it comes to technology, to me, is access. Because if you cannot even participate in the digital economy, then right there, we have a problem. And so this is a statistic on internet access, households that have no internet access or only dial-up. I didn't even realize dial-up still exists, but this was from 2018. And so you can see that American Indians, Alaska Natives, then Blacks, then Hispanics, and so forth, have a significant disadvantage in the numbers or the percentage of those populations that have eligible access to the internet. Income levels play a role. People may not be able to afford it, or living in the wrong place. In some places, it is still not common. There's no fiber in the ground. There's no wireless broadband being offered. There's no satellite access. So if you live in some rural areas, you're just out of luck. You won't be able, no matter how much money you have, to get that broadband. In some cases, it's also that the family is not interested, or even though broadband is accessible principally, the cost of the device might be too high, so the family does not have a device to actually connect to the broadband system. Now, I mentioned sort of the rural versus urban reality, but even if you take an area like Cleveland that principally has access across its entire footprint, you find that disparity, right? And so here it's now mainly driven from a cost perspective. The biggest reason for people not having that access is that either the broadband or the computer, i.e. the device, was too expensive. In some cases, people use options outside of the home. Maybe they go to the library, or they can access it at work or at school, some other place. For some others, it's the smartphone. So I don't have a PC or laptop with broadband access, but most of what I need to do online, I can do on my smartphone. So I don't need that access. Now, the smartphone will allow you to do some things, but when it comes to any data-rich activities, for example, it's very difficult to do that on the smartphone. And in some cases still, we have the reality that the access may not be available or the speed is not acceptable. So then the question is there a way of overcoming this digital divide, or will it widen even further? And there's sort of two cases for that. The case that says, this divide is just going to get wider and wider is the following. Even though we are introducing satellite-based broadband and maybe wireless broadband, as these technologies are evolving, they are becoming so data-rich, more and more video content, high-definition content, that even as the principal access is improving, the ability to use cutting-edge technologies, virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, is still not going to be a reality, except for those who are able to upgrade to the highest level of access, which again then becomes an economic question. You also need better equipment. You need a computer or laptop that has the processing power, has the graphics cards in it, et cetera, et cetera. So just expanding basic broadband, which is sort of the answer of the FTC right now, is not going to solve the problem. It's like building a highway in California. Whenever they add a lane, so many people have come to the area that already the highway is clogged up again, so they're going to widen it by another lane, by another lane. So we need to anticipate what the data volumes are going to be in the future. Now, the counterpoint is that, no, we could actually succeed at closing that, because 5G is going to cover a lot more areas, and it has super fast capabilities. Satellites are being shot up. Sometimes I see the string of satellites moving over our house at night, like pearls on a string. And the notion that the pandemic has actually made us much more aware. It has illustrated the challenges of some of our students and families to not have access, to not have devices, to have to sit in front of a McDonald's or even in the parking lot of the school to be able to do their homework. So there's a debate around whether adequate access should become a universal right. and whether it should be subsidized by the government so that everyone can participate in the digital economy. The current reality is that it is strongly divided along racial lines. I'm going to walk you through a series of examples now that show how specific technologies also have bias. The first one is facial recognition software. Facial recognition software is used, for example, in law enforcement. When officers are able to take a picture of a suspect, they may run it against a database of faces, and an algorithm tries to compare facial features and patterns to that database and then says, hey, we have identified this suspect as person X. In reality, this works much better with a much lower error rate for white faces than for black faces. And the reason for that is that when these facial recognition systems were trained to recognize faces, a big majority of the images that were used were white, and white males actually. And you may wonder now, well, why is that? Why couldn't you use more black males and black females and so forth? The challenge is that you actually need thousands and thousands of images. And the images you use, people have to have given their agreement to be utilized for purposes like that. And so nobody really has that many images or will incur the cost of taking fresh images. So everybody is buying image sets, and those image sets are compiled from stock data, and a lot of the stock pictures are coming from marketing or commercial applications. And in business, a lot of times the target audience are white males, so a lot of pictures were of white males. So because of the lack of representation in the training data, the system has become better at matching white faces. It is not performing adequately at matching black faces. And there are some really disturbing examples of people being arrested, falsely accused. And then it turns out it was because the system essentially misidentified them. The same is true for speech recognition. Again, you train speech recognition based on, in this case, speech samples rather than visual samples. And here again, the error rate for black speakers was 35%, 19% for white speakers. So it might, in this case, not be used to charge a person with a crime, but you try to translate voice to text. And if I pay for that service, I expect that whatever I say should be translated with a reasonable degree of accuracy. But here again, we have racially biased performance because when the software was trained, the share of diverse voice samples was too low to allow the system to properly recognize that information. Here's a second example, criminal offenses. So there's a system out there called Compass, and it was designed with all the best intentions. It basically gives an offender a survey of 137 questions, and they are hopefully truthfully answering all those questions. And then an algorithm determines what is the risk that that person will commit another offense upon their release. And that system is used by judges to set bail. It is used to determine the magnitude of sentences. And again, in that system, we find that there is racial bias. Sometimes, or not all the time, so the general performance of the system is good. It predicts fairly reasonably how likely somebody is to commit another offense upon their release. Where it does not do that correctly is where the racial bias comes into play. So Black people have a much higher chance of being categorized as a higher risk, even they would not commit follow-up offenses. And then if you drill into the survey, you could maybe get an idea for why that might be, because some of the questions include, for example, were you raised by a single parent? Did your parents separate, and so forth? And if we have a higher share of that occurrence in certain racial groups, then that's just part of their life reality. That doesn't make them a bad person. And so it has not been possible to really identify exactly which questions are causing this problem, because the company is refusing to disclose how the algorithm works. If you recall, if you attended the AI session, we talked a little bit about responsible AI and making your AI transparent. Having your AI be explainable is one of those dimensions of responsible AI. And so a company refusing to create that transparency, and I assume they're doing it for some kind of business secret or business advantage, here does not allow the researchers to really identify what the cause is, but they can describe the problem. Another one is autonomous vehicles. If you are a Black pedestrian, you have a higher chance to be hit by an autonomous vehicle than if you are a white pedestrian. And why is that? Because the car may not accurately identify you, either not identify you at all, or not identify you as a human being. And this goes back again to the training data. Vehicles use cameras, but also LiDAR and other features. And if someone with a darker skin is not being recognized, then it's typically because the AI in the car did not learn to recognize individuals with darker skin as humans, because they did not encounter those images in the training data. Most engineers were lighter skin, so there's when they went through that process, they didn't see it as a problem. They didn't look at the training data and say, oh, something is really flawed here, because they saw themselves in the training data. And maybe if we had had more diversity and representation among the engineers, that problem would have been discovered earlier, rather than releasing software that is so critical to public safety and then figuring out that it's not working properly. Now, there's a different scenario that we also discussed. Let's say from a recognition perspective, it could actually properly identify. But what if the algorithm makes explicit distinctions? We talked in our example a few weeks ago about the value of a child versus an older person, a female versus a male, a criminal versus a non-criminal, and so forth. So that would actually be the scenario that's even worse if the algorithm had some explicit distinctions based on race or characteristics that lead to race, and was biased on that basis, because that's not an unconscious bias. That would be an explicit bias being built into the AI. Here's example 4, robotics. Robotics was one of the topics, I think we covered it 2 weeks ago. And 2 interesting features, and I had never thought about this before. The first question is that researchers addressed: if you see a robot and the robot looks, white or Black or Asian, do we treat the robot with racial prejudice based on that look? And what they found is that is in fact the case. So even if it's not even a human, you give it a face of a certain race, and the biases that people hold against that race are transferred onto the perception of the robot. The second aspect is that today, the vast majority of robots that are out there, either the humanoid robots, I should say, either have an Asian or a white look. So now imagine these robots are taking on increased responsibilities, and we talked about their growing capabilities. Say they took on law enforcement responsibilities or crowd control responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. You could see a scenario where in minority communities, the presence of white robots or white robocops could be a concern from a racism or racial perception bias. Example number 5, drones. So a different technology, but one of the technologies that is being used in drones is image recognition and facial recognition. So some police departments are moving to the point where they are allowing the use of weaponized drones, be it for crowd control, so they put pepper spray onto the drones, or even drones equipped with lethal force capabilities. And how does the drone know who to target? Well, it could be using facial recognition software, or it could be using certain algorithms. That brings us right back to the examples we just discussed. If the facial recognition software is biased, if certain algorithms are biased, and we utilize those in the drones, we could be killing people based on racial bias. And then the question is, what is the control mechanism? What is the prefrontal cortex in the drone that is preventing that? Are the users going to be trained to not pull the trigger, or to sort of double check and double validate? Well, they would only do that if they are in fact aware of these technology biases. And if they were aware of the technology biases, they should be using the technology in the first place. So this is a real conundrum, another example of technology having moved ahead of our ability to properly regulate and put legal frameworks around that technology. Here's example 6, healthcare software. There's an algorithm in US hospitals that allocates healthcare to patients, basically deciding, should they get escalated treatment? Is their level of disease justifying a stay at the ICU or an expensive medication, et cetera, et cetera. And it, again, works to the disadvantage of Black people over white people. And how did this come about? So again, through surveys, the researchers identified what are different characteristics that people have. And one of the criteria was, how much money do you spend on healthcare every year? And it turned out Black people and white people spend about the same amount of money. So it was not viewed as an issue to use that variable. But when you dig deeper, it turns out that Black people are actually, on average, sicker than white people. So the way they are allocating money to their healthcare is different. While it ends up being the same amount, they're actually only using it when they are sicker. So that biased the algorithm. So to get the same level of care assigned, Black people actually had to be sicker in order to be referred by the algorithm. So another example where underlying data may have correlations that are not properly discovered. The algorithm is programmed with that data, and voila, we have a biased algorithm. The next example, this has been widely publicized, self-learning AI. So Microsoft wanted to put a chatbot out on Twitter to have friendly conversations with people. And they put a self-learning capability into that chatbot. So the chatbot was observing the dialogue that was occurring, the conversations people were having with it. And within a day, it turned from a friendly conversational chatbot into a fairly racist chatbot. Now, some of the worst examples that were people took screenshots were actually manipulated, because you could say, Ty, repeat after me, and then you said something and the chatbot would say, and then you took a screenshot and people would say, look at that, Microsoft's racist chatbot. But there were also examples where the chatbot on its own basically produced highly biased statements, misogynist statements, racially insensitive statements, and so forth, because it had learned that style of conversation, of communication from the people on Twitter. It was not a reflection of a bad program. It was mimicking bad human behavior. And unfortunately, some of our worst behavior comes out on social media. So Microsoft terminated that project. Here's another example, search engines. If you have autocomplete in your search engine, I love this feature because sometimes I'm looking for something and I'm starting to type in the first 3-4 words and voila, that's exactly what I was looking for. How did you know? Well, because I wasn't the first person in the world looking for that. Google had encountered that search query multiple times, and it was suggesting certain, ways in which that sentence that I started could be completed. Well, if you test that and you say, black girls are, and see what is being suggested, or white girls are and what is being suggested, in that case, you find that the search engines themselves are presenting a lot of stereotypes at the very top of the list. And so again, this is not a function that some Google engineer thought that these stereotypes are the best choices, but the way the search engine works is basically from the context of what others have previously entered, it prioritizes. It does not have a filter that says this is, more accurate or not. It just uses frequency to deduct that. So there's an entire book here, Algorithms of Oppression, that describes various examples of how search engines reinforce the racism. Because let's say I am not of that opinion. I have no previous experience with a certain race or a certain country that I want to travel to, but then I enter that, and these are all the criteria that are now being presented to me. Well, that's my first impression. The bias is being formed in my brain right now through the search engine. Let me again stop here briefly and see if there are any questions about these examples of racial bias in new technologies.
Oliver, I have a question.
Yes.
Was there any study done when we were talking about the color or look of the humanoid robots about making the robots totally non-human, so looking like a green or a blue robot, and was then the acceptance of that robot then less likely to be accepted because they don't look like us?
Yeah, I did not see that in the context of these studies, but when we talked about robots a couple of weeks ago, I showed examples of the desire to make the robots more and more human-like, because what they found is that, for example, in a hotel situation, if you walk up to a concierge and the concierge is a machine, then people have a more adverse reaction to that than if the concierge is a machine that looks like a human. Of course, they still prefer the real human, but there is sort of the perception. Again, it goes back to, is that robot more like me or totally different from me? And if it at least appears to look like me, and it has maybe facial expression features, and it can speak like a human, then it is more likely to be perceived in the category of human-like, and people seem to appreciate that. Now, your point is a good one. Let's make them all blue or pink or purple or whatever, right? And then we could at least eliminate that racial connotation, but then we would also have to consider the facial features. Color is not the only feature. We would have to consider the language. Is it going to speak with a certain accent? Is it going to speak high English, which is more of a white way of speaking? Or, so there's multiple dimensions that would have to be considered.
Can I ask, Oliver, that all the examples that you have presented, those 8 examples, they are all systematic racism bias, right?
You could make the argument that because they have been implemented, they are not examples of an individual bias, but they could go back to individual biases of the engineers or the people who were in charge of quality control, not recognizing the bias in the software because they themselves had a bias, right? So it is systemic bias as the result of accumulation of individual biases in some cases.
Okay. The reason I'm asking this question because this leads me to the source of bias is not genetic. It is learned bias.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so which in turn actually leads me to see that where we should attack this bias thinking. Okay, what creates this bias so that we can focus on attacking that particular thing. This is the line of thinking I'm having.
Yes, absolutely. The ability to form bias is genetic. The nature of the bias is learned, right? So our brain gives us the ability to create shortcuts, but which shortcuts we choose or which shortcuts form, not by choice, which shortcuts form is a function of the stimuli that we are exposed to, the examples that we see. So you're exactly right. These are examples where we learn the bias. And you will see in a moment that that is exactly one of the ways we could tackle the problem, that we change that learning mechanism or that we relearn in a certain way. Any other questions about the examples that I've shared? All right, then let's look at opportunities that come from new technologies. So again, I'm going to take a step back first before I get into the technology. This is a great report here on the background of racial bias, and it has a chapter in it on interventions. So what can be done to overcome racial bias? And so there are some examples of de-biasing. One of the examples is people were asked to imagine a representative of a group against which maybe they held a bias, but focus on a counter-stereotypical individual. So imagine President Obama or a very smart African-American professor or something like that, right? And it turned out that the more people imagined these examples of counter-stereotypical individuals, the more their bias was weakened. Another example was exposing people to individuals, allowing them to learn a story about an individual. A lot of children's books, for example, sort of introduce other ethnicities by telling stories of children or stories of people. And that was also effective because then the story of that individual replaced the more general perception of the entire group of people. Obtaining information in a first-person perspective. So if a member of a targeted minority group could tell their story, this is my life, this is how it is impacting me. If people could witness that type of evidence, it had a tendency to reduce their bias. And then, of course, increasing opportunities for contact. That is the hardest because now you actually need to bring people in touch with each other. There has to be a willingness, there has to be availability, and so forth. Preventing biased decision-making. So one of the key things is question objectivity, right? If we could always say, are we really sure this data is accurate? Have we really double-checked, right? So always carry that doubt in the back of your mind and question the objectivity. That is how we activate our prefrontal cortex to sort of not just believe in what the data is presenting us, but always questioning it. Increasing the motivation to be fair. So for example, if judges know, or if law enforcement officers know that sometimes they may be subject to subconscious bias, if they are made aware of that through a training program, if they get a better understanding of the mechanisms behind it, maybe even listening to this presentation here today, having examples of the impact, it instills in them the desire to try to be more fair, and that reduces the biased decision making. And then the last example is improving the conditions of decision making. So instead of forcing an on-the-spot decision, slow down the process, put in some filters, and you're going to see some really cool examples of that here in a minute. So this topic has reached the technology community. Not too long ago here, June 28th, just a few weeks ago, there was a conference on this topic. How can we design anti-racist technologies for a just future? So you have the link here, Stanford University. Not all the examples that they featured at their conference actually really showed great examples, but I have to admit, I also did not watch the 2-day-long recording of the conference. I only read the summary. So if you're really passionate about seeing what's being developed, there's a 2-day-long recording of this conference. Here's a powerful example, virtual reality. Remember that the first-person perspective, seeing reality through the eyes of the individual of a minority, was a powerful way of reducing bias. Well, virtual reality is perfect to give you that experience. It immerses you into a computer-generated or image-generated reality. And so there's a lot of R-based anti-bias training. Google has a program for that. And so here are a few examples. There's a video game that an African-American young man created. And it basically, the scenario is it's a black dad with his son driving around, and then they get pulled over by police, and you have certain choices, but it's sort of a really tough way to not allow the situation to escalate. So it's sort of a very concerning experience. And then another game is I Am a Man. It takes you back to the civil rights era, and you can play through different scenarios. What was it like in that era, in that context, to be protesting for civil rights? There are several other games. One takes you back to a Japanese American internment camp to experience that reality. So they all try the same logic, immersing you and allowing you to see life or a scene, a scenario through the eyes of the member of the minority. Here's an article I found. This was actually written all the way back in 2012, and it was shocking me because it was taking a different stance. It said, what if somebody was abusing augmented reality? So in virtual reality, you have goggles that are basically closed off. All you see is the computer screen or the image that is being projected. In augmented reality, you can still see the real world, but through your goggles or through your display, additional information is presented. And so in this science fiction scenario, if you will, somebody said, what if people started to wear these glasses and then the glasses impose filters? Maybe they change the skin tone of people that you encounter to make them look more like yourself. Or what if they actually, how TikTok or some of the other apps, they have these fun filters, but what if the technology actually made fun of certain members of a minority, exaggerated stereotypes, or even put a warning sign, avoid this person? And this was really troubling because I'm just thinking back to our national discourse and how people from the left and people from the right seem to be living in two completely different realities. Well, what if now they can buy the Make America Great Again versus the Black Lives Matter glasses, and it literally presents them with a different view of reality. So technology could also be abused to further accentuate racial bias. And I had never really seen or heard that before, so I wanted to include that example. Back to the positive side, Barcelona is one of many smart cities, but they're trying to do things a little bit differently. They're tackling the same types of issues, pollution, lighting, air quality, waste management, et cetera, but recognizing that, if you don't involve your citizens, you may be making some mistakes. You may be creating a system that has implied bias. They focus on a people-centric approach. So they have identified who is living in digital poverty, for example. They're making explicit efforts to bring those people into the digital economy, not just by providing devices and access, but also by closing the training gap. They are involving their citizens in the selection of pilot projects and in the supervision of these projects. And this is not trivial, they are paying very close attention to who is actually developing these technologies, and is their representation male, female, or different ethnicities in those developers. So I thought that was a great example of mindfulness on behalf of an institution to avoid having bias embedded in the technology. Another great example, this is from San Francisco District Attorney. So the DA gets a lot of police reports every day. And how do you avoid that your DA is making a decision to charge the individual or not based on a racial bias? So in this case, they developed an AI that takes the police report and then identifies anything in that police report that could trigger a racial bias, a name, a certain neighborhood, any other identifying information, and so forth, and it blacks that out, right? It does not black out the facts of the crime, but it blacks out all of these decisions. And so now the DA is basically forced to say, just based on the facts, I don't know if this is a white, black, Asian, et cetera, person. I don't know what their name is. I can't infer race, but just based on the facts, what decision would I make, right? And so that's an attempt of eliminating bias by making, I talked earlier about slowing down the decision or removing information that could trigger bias. So I had not seen AI used in that manner to essentially redact information automatically before decisions are made. And the good thing is Stanford University has agreed to make this software available at no cost to the public. You could see this being used not only in law enforcement, but this could also be used in recruiting, maybe even in the admission process for higher education. One of the problems I was discussing earlier was that there are not enough images of Black people or other minorities in the training data sets. And there's an interesting way of overcoming that, because AI is now capable of actually generating, fake people, if you will, images of people in different ethnicities. In this case, it was done with a so-called style generator. So you could see the people on the top, that was sort of the source profile. And then the people on the left is the style. And then the AI basically created a person that looked like the person on the top, but in the style of the person on the left. So none of these people in the resulting matrix are actually real people. They were all generated by AI. And that could be a way of creating a richer data set for facial recognition software to be trained. So the conundrum is here that an AI is now training another AI. Maybe there's going to be different issues that result from that. Pushing the envelope a little bit, we talked about brain-machine interfaces in the past. So if I'm a decision maker and I'm subjected to bias, maybe my awareness and my training is already helping me control it. But what if I could actually see that my sort of bias intensive areas of the brain are firing when I'm making a decision. This is hypothetical. I included this. This is not real science. The biggest challenge is to isolate those signals, because our amygdala is firing lots and lots of signals all the time. So which of them are pertaining to the decision that I am making? But this could help, almost like biofeedback, train people, help them understand when their biases are influencing their decisions, and then as a result, possibly restructure their neural pathways. So in conclusion, racial bias is embedded in many technologies today. The common causes are lack of representation of minorities in the data sets and in the ranks of those developing the technologies. We've looked at the principles of how bias is created and how it can be overcome, and those principles should be understood by everyone. This should be sort of basic standard knowledge, and I learned a lot in preparing for this. I was not aware of the neurological causes of bias and in some of the techniques that would allow me to work on my own biases, for example. But if you have responsibilities to develop, purchase, implement, utilize technology, then this type of knowledge should definitely be mandatory. So if we can use technology to contain our unconscious brain pathways by slowing things down, by eliminating, redacting information, and at the same time mobilizing the medial prefrontal cortex, we can contribute to the reduction of implicit bias, and these capabilities exist. And some of these capabilities are technology supported. So technology can help us overcome bias. And then sort of as a mantra, doubt the objectivity of your data, ask the question, drill deeper, don't accept the black box answers. And I don't know if black box in itself is a racist term. So I am now more aware, and I'm asking the question whether there is eventually some racism involved in even that. Any questions on what you just heard? All right, hearing none, we went a little bit over, so I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. We'll be back next week, and another exciting topic. Next week, we'll be talking about new technologies and democracy. So another very hot topic in the contemporary discussion, and I look forward to seeing you all back next week. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.